Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and you're watching Culturally Determined, and my guest today is Daniel Bessner. Daniel, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Daniel Bessner, as Aryeh just said, and I'm a professor in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Assistant professor, I should say.
Thanks for coming on. So we have a couple topics to talk about today. The first one, we have to warn our viewers and listeners that if you have small children, you might not want to let them listen to this episode because it's going to contain some strong language.
Yes, most definitely.
So Anthony Scaramucci, also known as the Mooch, just gave an interview, although I think he probably didn't think it was on the record. That's probably the most logical explanation, to Ryan Lizza of The New Yorker, in which he really went off half-cocked or full-cocked, maybe. And he insults multiple other people in the White House, lavishes praise on Donald Trump, but has some immortal lines, one of which I'll read. He says, quote, "I'm not Steve Bannon. I'm not trying to suck my own cock. I'm not trying to build my own brand off the fucking strength of the president. I'm here to serve the country." And then Lizza adds, "Bannon declined to comment."
Yes.
What do you make of this?
Well, it's hard to sort of talk ill or speak ill about a fellow brother of Long Island, like myself. We're both from Long Island, but it seems to me just, it's interesting. I think I forget where I read this, but I'd like to attribute it, but that there's these two contingents within the Trump administration, the sort of Trump universe. It must have been Chapo Trap House, I think, sort of the Trump universe of the New York-based, outer boroughs or Long Island crew that Trump might be most comfortable with, having come up in the New York real estate business in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and then sort of this other Republican. Actually, maybe three. So there's the New York group, Scaramucci represented, the Republican mainstream represented by Reince, and then sort of the Bannon pseudo-alt-right Breitbart contingent. And it seems like there's all of these groups that are vying for power and that essentially hate each other, and sort of, I guess, Kushner, and then the fourth contingent, which is the Trump family.
The family.
So there's these four power centers sort of operating, circumnavigating, going around Trump, and that they're all vying for supremacy. And what's interesting is that it doesn't seem to be like there's anyone really steering the ship of state here in this particular instance, because I don't think Trump really is much of a leader. I don't think he's led much in his life, and I don't think he has much of a leadership strategy. So it's not surprising that you see these types of strange outbursts from people like Scaramucci or Bannon or Priebus doing, or Priebus, I don't even know how it's pronounced, Priebus doing the Yeah, it's Priebus. Priebus making these statements to the press that are frankly insane and kind of unprecedented in recent American history. So to me, it signals nothing more than a lack of leadership style and a leadership coherence.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. I mean, you outlined four groups. That makes sense to me, but I think you can really split into two groups. I've said this on Twitter a couple times. Anyone who willingly goes to work for Donald Trump is either a fucking moron or a soulless careerist. So Scaramucci is a fucking moron, and I grew up in northern New Jersey. He does strike me as a very outer-borough ethnic type of person, but he also seems like the type of person who thinks because he did very well in business that he's smart and doesn't realize that he's an idiot. But
he's also very well educated. I believe he went to Tufts and Harvard.
Well,
as well.
I'm sure you can go to very good schools and still be a fucking moron.
No. Of course, but I think the point is that he's not like someone who went to Solomon Brothers in 1982 straight out of high school, right? He's someone who's also a product of the American meritocratic system. So I think that's what makes it even more interesting, right? Is that there's sort of all these elements of meritocracy, interacting within the Trump administration. I mean, Bannon, Goldman Sachs, Kushner, Harvard, Scaramucci, Goldman Sachs or some other bank and Harvard. And so that's also a really interesting element, considering the fact that even though people are treating Trump as sort of sui generis, to some degree he's really, or at least the people around him, are products of the system that was supposed to, save the American people from themselves. And that's a really interesting rub that I think more people should pay attention to. So what does that mean about, one, the institutions that produce these types of people, and two, the meritocratic system as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's well said. Yeah, it is, Scaramucci does have the pedigrees of someone who you think would have a better control or sense of self. I mean, well, and why do you think he is acting the way he is? Is that just his core personality? I mean, it almost seems like he's auditioning to be, he's trying to be in Trump's good graces by being Trumpier than Trump and trying to embody the characteristics that Trump likes in himself and maybe was once able to embody but no longer can because of age and cognitive decline.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that of why he did this, which obviously seems particularly insane. I mean, this seems like a very strange thing for someone to do. So I think there's an element of that, but I think it might also be a little simpler, is that these are the sorts of tactics that allowed him to succeed in his business for the majority of his life and to become an incredibly wealthy man and to become someone who people, call to enter the White House, right? And so then again, that raises more, I think, more interesting questions behind this particularly strange outburst. And what does this say about the culture, again, of these sort of hyper-elite institutions that have such an influence on American politics and American public policy, and that this is the type of culture that is allowed to thrive. And then there's another element which I haven't seen people talking about that much. It seems like people have been mostly making fun of, people being Twitter, which is where these things blow up today and are forgotten tomorrow. But people seem to be focusing primarily on sort of the ethnic outer-borough aspect of it, making Italian jokes, et cetera, et cetera. But there's really a hyper-masculine element to it. And there's really interesting things to say about the dynamics of gender in the Trump administration and what this says about someone like Scaramucci, that he could go around and say something like this about what it must be to be one of the few women in the Trump administration as well, with this hyper-masculine and gendered language about I'm going to kick your fucking ass, I'm going to suck my own cock, or I'm not sucking my own cock, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Not to say, the implicit homophobia of the entire remark.
Yeah.
And then,
I think the way Scaramucci was talking is probably the way he talks when he thinks he's not being recorded, and he just was too stupid to realize that, calling up Ryan Lizzen, chatting with him in his previous life was maybe, I'm guessing Scaramucci was one of these people who was constantly leaking to the press and would be like a source close to Trump, says that Trump thinks X. So he probably has good, why was he appointed communications director? He must be, he seems like a schmoozer, and he has a good relationship with a lot of people in the press because he's like an entertaining guy and can talk a mile a minute. But at the same time, it's not like he came from a communications firm. He's a hedge fund guy or whatever the fuck he is.
Well, so that's why this doesn't matter at all, right? I mean, it's not like I think we're almost still operating under this old system where someone has expertise in something that matters. But what I think you and I probably experience in our own lives, given our own educational backgrounds, is as long as you have these sorts of imprimaturs from these various institutions, you could do whatever the hell you want, so that there's this sort of like quote unquote meritocracy that governs everything. And you could go from Goldman Sachs to the communications center of the White House, and it doesn't really matter because you've been vetted in these various ways. And again, what is to say about the system? I mean, I'm a historian, even though I'm a historian of ideas, I like focusing on the system and what allows this sort of rhetoric or this sort of person to succeed in the way that he has. And I think that's really the critical point, regardless of like the obvious ridiculousness of this whole incident.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. What you were saying, what that reminds me of is when you're a celebrity, they let you do it.
Right.
One of Trump's lines from the infamous Billy Bush recording.
Right.
So there's men with power behave badly.
Yeah, there's this ecosystem that allows us to thrive, and what sort of happens with Trump is that the emperor has no clothes anymore, and we could see how these sorts of structures actually function in their most debased form, in their most vulgar form. And so that's what's interesting about when Trump was coming up throughout the campaign, is that there were all these critiques of his vulgarity. Right. It was what sort of the establishment liked the least about Trump. Less his policy proposals, even though there were disagreements with that, but it was the vulgarity of it.
Yeah.
And so why the vulgarity? What is it about the vulgarity that really attracted the ire of both liberals and mainstream conservatives alike? And that's, I think,
do you have an answer to that? I mean, it seems like the Trump, something Jeet here said is that Trump takes the subtext and makes it text. He says the thing that you're not supposed to say, and it's not like he uses dog whistles. He'll just explicitly say it. He'll say Mexicans are rapists instead of saying it in a euphemistic way that's supposed to communicate the idea. He just goes out and says it. So what do you think?
It's really interesting. This is just, I'm just thinking about it really now, but it seems like what vulgarity does is that it exposes the system rhetorically in a way that it's usually not exposed. By having such a powerful and influential person use vulgar rhetoric or vulgar language to call out the system, it seems like it's exposing it as something that's either dynamic or changing or not sort of to be looked upon with respect. And I think that's what Trump's vulgarity, why it upset so many people. And what someone on the left might say is that the system was already vulgar, and what Trump does is just exposes it to its utmost degree. But I think that's why people particularly didn't like his vulgarity. Although this is just a guess, I haven't done really any study or research about it. But that seems like what people found so offensive about it. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense to me. I mean, I think he exposes the emptiness of some of our rhetoric about public life. And I mean, we'll talk about this piece I wrote, The Incredible Lightness of Donald, later, but, we pride ourselves on being this great deliberative democracy, and yet this totally absurd, foolish figure is our elected leader. So what does that say about the system that our sainted founding fathers constructed for us?
And of course, any knowledge of, any sort of not cursory knowledge of history will tell you that that's essentially not true, and it hasn't been true for a while. Mm. I mean, so this is what's so interesting, is that, for historians, none of this is really a shock, right? Either in terms of our foreign policy, as the op-ed we'll talk about later, or in terms of sort of the structures of American democracy and how vulgar and damaging they really can be, in a real way to real people's lives, and have been for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the Marx's line about tragedy and farce. Like we've entered the farce stage of. Although I do think Trump is a sui generis figure, he certainly is farcical. And speaking of things that Trump does that are unusual, yesterday on Twitter he announced in a way that led some people at the Pentagon to think that perhaps he was about to declare war on North Korea, that actually he was banning transgender people from serving in the military. And this blew up. Today, the Pentagon released a statement saying something to the effect of, no actual policy has changed. We'll let you know when it does. So it's really unclear right now what's going to happen. But what did you think about what happened yesterday?
Well, I think it's important to start off with just how cruel it is in sort of a dual sense. One, it's cruel to deny anyone any sorts of rights or abilities to do anything based on something like gender identity or gender preference or sexual preference, racial, ethnic, we all know the situation. But it was almost doubly cruel because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the anniversary of the day that Truman desegregated the military.
Right, which I'm sure Trump knew, and,
or someone around him knew. Well, Trump certainly didn't know.
No, Trump didn't. I'm joking. Trump didn't know, but I doubt actually anyone in his orbit knew that either.
You think so? That seems like a pretty wacky coincidence to sort of.
Well, like I said, they're all either morons or, just people who are doing this for a resume item. There are no geniuses who work for Donald Trump. I believe that pretty firmly.
Yeah, so that's doubly cruel. But what's also interesting about the response, which I completely agree with, like this is a cruel thing to do to anyone, an incredibly cruel thing, and no right-thinking person, I think, should possibly promote it. But it's interesting that this is where historically and also today, so many of these civil rights battles are fought is in the military realm. So if you go back to 92, 93, with Clinton trying to allow homosexual gay people to serve in the military, that was like the big flashpoint. And now we have this flashpoint earlier with Chelsea Manning, and now over trans people in the military. And I'm just curious what you think is that how come so many of these debates center around military service? Is it because military service is considered like an unalloyed good, and it's sort of like a prideful thing for people to do? It's a noble thing for people to do, and that to deny someone the ability to do this noble act is particularly cruel. I'm just curious why in recent American history so many of the debates have centered around the military. Seems peculiar.
Well, I mean, the military is seen as the core of what it means to be America.
So that's problematic. I mean, that's extremely problematic, if that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think it is. I mean,
so it's tied up with empire, essentially.
Yeah, and there's this whole, idea that if you see a person in uniform, you're supposed to thank them for their service, and these people
you send them to die.
Yeah, are once treated pretty shabbily, and they're often, people who. Well, many people who enlist do so because they don't have other career options, or they don't have enough education to get a different kind of job, or they want to enter the military so they can get education, get job training. But then we treat them as these secular saints. So it's vexed.
Well, rhetorically, not now. I mean, ask anyone go to a sort of VA doctor or get benefits or something along those lines. Yeah,
right.
I mean,
rhetorically, we treat them as untouchable.
And
practically, we treat them rather shabbily. Yeah, so it's a huge hypocrisy.
But whose hypocrisy are we talking about now? We're basically talking about the spheres that you and I sort of navigate, right? Like the American elite, the American the American meritocratic elite.
Well, I think everyone, although Trump did insult John McCain's military service, no one can. I made a joke on Twitter after this came out. Who's going to be the first person who says, actually, it's a good thing that trans people can't serve in the military because the military is, responsible for crimes against humanity and is an agent of evil American imperialism. Right. So fewer people in the military are a good thing. I did see a couple people earnestly making that kind of argument.
Sure, yeah, and that's a typical argument. I mean, you'll always hear that argument, but the interesting thing is why the military, and then I think it gets to that question of like it's about the core of being an American, like you said. And then it gets to the question about whose core, because no one you or I know, or probably very few people you or I know, have served in the military, right? And but the people,
so in the elite worlds, there's fewer people.
Far fewer. I mean, that's not a question. That's
and you're certainly only a couple people from my high school went into the military, a good public school in northern New Jersey. My brother-in-law actually is in the military. He went to West Point.
Okay, so that's elite. That's not.
Yeah, so he's an elite person in the military. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that this was something I heard circa 2003, 2004 by one of the leaders of the log cabin Republicans gave a talk at my college, and he was making the case that the things that the gay rights movement wanted in 2003 were repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, gay marriage legalized, and for him it was allowing gay men to serve in the priesthood. So three things that are all conservative institutions. You wanted to let gay people have access to those conservative institutions. Right.
So it's sort of the de-radicalization of what might be called LGBTQ politics to some degree, sort of the trend that we've been seeing in American life. And I think that's actually really interesting in what it says about larger structures of American society. And where did you go to school?
I went to Yale.
Where's that? Never heard of it.
I went to school in Connecticut.
Yeah, I went to school in Connecticut. Okay, so interesting. So so his point was trying to get the next generation of liberal elites, the log cabin Republican, on the side of or on a more conservative side by saying your progressive goals are actually going to be best represented in conservative institutions.
Yeah, or it's the argument was made by some gay activists that marriage was not the right goal for the gay rights movement because marriage is a reactionary, patriarchal
a naturally reactionary institution, right? Yeah. And the Windsor case was also about inheritance, right?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have all the major sort of gay rights cases in American history have been totally organized around what one might consider at least traditional, if not conservative, traditional American institutions: the military, marriage, inheritance. And I don't know exactly what that says, but that says something. That says something unique about American life, I think, or American culture.
Right. I think movements that have, fight for the equality of outgroups do best when they try to integrate into the majority culture. And I think that's one difference between the success of the civil rights movement with something like Black Lives Matter. Saying the civil rights movement rhetoric of saying we want the same thing that you have versus the Black Lives Matter message is more like, and I'm having trouble saying this in a way that maybe isn't going to get me in trouble, but, the reply to Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter is seen as admitting that I'm a racist, but during the civil rights movement, there were people marching with placards that said, "I'm a man."
Right. So you're saying it's a more universalistic versus a more particularistic claim.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah. Well
so
said.
Then no problem. But then the problem is, what do you do when you need to make particularistic claims because different groups have different outcomes and different experiences?
It's harder within the American system, I think.
Right. So then again, it comes to larger things about the United States, and what it means to be in these United States, sort of the problems inherent in these various cultural aspects and social systems, right, which are very interesting in terms of both organizing strategy and just political realities and what happens.
So I wanted to ask you did you think that this is going to be a political winner for Trump? Because I kind of think it won't be.
Oh, no, I don't think it will be either. I mean, I'm not too familiar with the military. I'm familiar with it more historically. But from what I could tell, most military, especially of our generation, and even probably a few years older, they don't really give a shit about these sorts of issues. But again, then this gets to the question of America as gerontocracy, right? People 30 and 40 years older certainly do give a shit. Again, people who are going to send the people to die, not the ones who are actually doing the fighting and the dying. But I don't think it's a political winner either for Trump or the Republican Party in the long run. And I think you could see that with the fact that the military is basically trying to punt a little bit on this issue and saying Trump has to give them a direct order or something along those lines, and that Twitter is not a particularly good way to do that. But an issue that I think is actually most critical about this is that what does this say about civilian control of the military? Because in my mind, civilian control of the military is one of the most fundamental things in American history, one of the most fundamental structures of politics enshrined in the Constitution, that the civilian authority, Donald Trump, controls the military. So what if Trump starts saying further crazy things like about bombing North Korea, et cetera, and the military disagrees? Now, I'm not one to sort of harp on the breaking of norms, because I think a lot of these norms have been actually quite damaging, and norms change over time. But I think this is not even a norm. This is sort of a constitutional prerogative, and I think that's really the most damaging thing here. Even if the military disagrees, is this the first step on a slippery slope to sort of breaking the very critical practice of the military heeding what the civilian had to say?
Yeah, I do think it's not, it's not crazy to speculate about a possible military coup at this point. Like, I don't think it's likely to happen.
A soft coup, not like in Washington, D.C., sort of like the military. Trump is in power, but the military doesn't listen to him.
Yeah, I think that is within the realm of possibility. I also don't think this is going to be a political winner. I think that there just aren't that many transgender people for this to really drive people crazy in a way that, like, gay marriage drove them crazy in 2003, 2004. We're talking about less than 1% of the population. So practically this is not a huge deal either way. So I don't think it's going to have that much political effect. I think
it's a cultural signifier,
Yeah, it's a culture war. It's culture war symbolism. I think one thing I read was that the fight was actually about funding gender reassignment, or whatever the correct term is, surgery for people who are in the military, which is expensive, I suppose. And the conservatives in the House wanted to put an amendment in preventing that, and they conveyed that to Trump, and he turned that into banning transgender people entirely, which doesn't make a ton of sense, but I guess made sense to Trump. So he, the wedge issue was, we're not going to pay for these crazy people who want to, change their bits around, but he turned it into more of a political loser by saying we're openly discriminating against these people for who they are, which is not a long-term winning strategy in America, I think.
No, it's absolutely not. And again, when we say the culture signifier, I mean, I think people 40 and under are much less interested in the culture wars because they have actual material concerns to worry about. So again, this is really signaling to different generations as well. And I think that's also a critical thing to recognize about who is this signaling to, just in terms of age and in terms of power elite within the parties. And so again, I think you're going to see a split. I don't know what will happen with this. I imagine not much. I don't think that if the military is like, no, I don't think Trump is going to override them.
I don't think I don't think he cares at all about this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think he cares at all about this. So I think he's going to be on to another thing. But again, this raises really troubling questions about civil-military relations that people should keep an eye on more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't we shift a little bit to discussing an article that appeared in the Times July 22nd. The author is Stephen Wertheim, and the headline is Donald Trump's Plan to Save Western Civilization. This got so much comment that they actually ran a follow-up piece with a Q&A with the author. Could you describe the argument of this piece for people who haven't read it?
Yeah, Stephen, just to full disclosure, Stephen and I have co-authored a piece together in Foreign Affairs, and we agree, I think, pretty much on the broad elements of present U.S. foreign policy. And the essential argument of the piece, as I took it, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is the idea that pretty much since Trump's campaign began, American liberals, particularly what we might call the U.S. foreign policy establishment, liberals in the foreign policy establishment, liberal interventionists, people who advocate in favor of what might be called the liberal world order is a technical term, U.S. global leadership, U.S. promotion of open markets, democracy, human rights, regardless of whether or not that is actually true. That is what some people argue the United States has done. And so what Stephen is arguing is that Trump is actually not a break in the traditions of American foreign policy since roughly 1945, or one can say 1898, but is rather a continuation in the sense that he believes he is fighting on behalf of Western civilization, and he believes that the United States must assert itself as a global leader, which is rhetoric that has been used by American presidents from Teddy Roosevelt to Franklin Roosevelt to Truman to Eisenhower and so on to George W. Bush to Obama down till today. And so what Stephen was arguing in the piece, or at least is what I took him to be arguing, was that we have to reckon, or liberals in the foreign policy establishment have to reckon with the fact that Trump, to a large degree, is governing as they want someone to govern. And what does this mean about the prospects of U.S. global leadership, or even about the morality of the entire American project since 1945? Did you think that was an accurate description, or was I missing something?
Yeah, that describes it accurately. So when I read this, when we were talking about discussing this piece, I read it and I wrote to you, "This is total BS." And you said you agreed with it, so I think this could be a fruitful discussion. Like I said before, I think Trump is a stupid person, and I think he is suffering from the early stages of some form of cognitive decline.
That's what I would not say. I would say he's not stupid. I would say the latter is probably, it seems to be true.
Okay.
And that's a distinction. He's not an idiot.
Well, I don't know. He's certainly a canny operator, but, it's not like he reads books in his spare time or anything.
He's not intellectually curious whatsoever.
Right.
I would say that is correct.
So he has some foreign policy impulses, but I don't think he really understands enough, cares enough, to have anything you'd call coherent foreign policy. He has some advisors who care about this. He's able to read a speech in which it seems like he can fake seeming like he's serious. He reads it very slow, like that.
Right,
so he'll read whatever is put in front of him. He seems to have a penchant for authoritarians like the leader of the Philippines and Vladimir Putin and the leader of Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
But let's say Saudi Arabia has been a long-standing ally of the United States, who every American president has supported both rhetorically and with plenty of money.
But only one of them grasped the glowing orb at the same time.
Well, that's just ridiculous.
And that was Donald Trump.
Yeah, true. I mean, but that's just sort of goes to, again, the vulgarity issue. But Obama gave quite a bit of money to Saudi Arabia, just as Bush did, just as Clinton did, just as Bush the first did, just as Reagan did, et cetera, and so on.
Okay, I agree with that. But I don't think you could say that Trump has any sort of plan, or I guess he's long seen himself as a world historical figure and wants to be seen that way. He doesn't especially like foreigners very much, but I don't think that he can be said to have any sort of real grand strategy or cohesive foreign policy or anything that is related to a larger idea beyond he wants to get attention and he wants to have people like him.
No, for sure. And then, I mean, I don't think I don't think Stephen would necessarily disagree with that. I mean, I think that then the question becomes about systems, and the system sort of puttering on no matter who's at the helm, right? So even if this buffoonish figure who actually kind of ran on a pseudo-isolationist platform can't do anything but do what everyone else would have done, again, what does that say about the system? And I think that's what his call is for. His call is not for liberal, even though sort of the headline made it seem that way, et cetera. His call, Aryeh, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, cool. Yeah, I could hear you just first. Okay, perfect. So his critique is not necessarily that liberals literally, or liberal members of the U.S. foreign policy establishment need to accept Trump as their own, like Trump qua Trump. What he's really saying is, what does this say about the system? About this system of global leadership that Trump is currently at the helm at, and is kind of just doing the same things. And really, McMaster and Mattis, from what we can tell, are kind of running the show on foreign policy.
Right.
So then, I mean, so there were all these calls to basically defend the liberal international order, which is what Trump is doing. So what does that say about the liberal international order?
Right. And I think, Trump could have, he could appoint someone like John Bolton to a position of power, a foreign policy ideologue, but instead, I think it's almost like he knows he's out of his depth, so he appointed generals, which in his simplistic reading, going back to what we said, he's an American like everyone else, and I'm sure he respects the military a lot, so he wants to appoint a four-star general and feels good about the fact that he's the boss of a four-star general. So so those institutionalists are keeping the ship going. He doesn't really care about this at all. But people like Bannon care about it and see we need a movement to protect the West. I'm sure he thinks he's engaged in something like that. But Trump himself has no idea what he's doing.
But what's so interesting is about sort of the rhetoric of Western civilization could be used by both the Bannon and both the McMaster, even though they might have wildly different foreign policy perspectives. What I think is that they actually don't have very different foreign policy perspectives. Bannon would actually probably want to do less abroad in terms of military intervention than a McMaster or a Mattis. But everyone seems to agree that that the United States needs to dominate the world, that there's really no true room for coming to terms with other nations in a real way that would lead to less hierarchy in the international sphere, that the United States should continue to outspend all of the a panoply of other nations on its military, that the United States needs to be able to continue to act when and how it wants, regardless of international sovereignty, that there's no reason to really abide by international law. That I don't know what Trump seems to be doing a little, pretty much doing what Obama did in terms of drone strikes and things along those lines.
Right. Yeah. It seems like he's relaxed the rules of engagement or whatever. So there's more. He said during the campaign he was going to bomb the shit out of ISIS, and so it seems like he's told. The order has gone down that the drone operators don't need as much caution or whatever. So more civilians are being killed, but he hasn't changed any of the strategy. But
when you actually look at Obama had basically rubber stamped lawyers to approve essentially anything that he wanted in terms of drones, right? So I mean, if you look at the practicality again, if you move past the vulgarity and the sort of emperor has no clothes element of it all. What's the difference?
Well, I think like I said, the giant cruise ship of American foreign policy has continued on its path, despite the fact that the captain has changed and is now a madman. So he could try to shift it a little bit. I mean, something mentioned in the piece is, he bombed that airfield in Syria, even though he kind of ran as an American First isolationist. I think what happened in that case was he was shown photographs of children who had been gassed to death, and he, like anyone else, felt bad about that, and so he said, okay, order these strikes. Right. So I don't think there was any kind of grand strategy behind it. I think it was just him reacting in the moment like he does most of the time.
But that's just a quick incident. So it almost seems that what we're saying is that we've approached a Thatcherian or a Thatcherite moment in American foreign policy where no one could even imagine an alternative to total U.S. global leadership and dominance, right? So I think all of this, and that's what I think Stephen's op-ed was getting at or trying to get at, is that there's this liberal world order. Every mainstream person supports it. And there's no way of envisioning the alternatives. And they critique Trump for his vulgarity and for his supposed difference, but the way he's actually governing in terms of policy is exactly like every president has governed for decades, right? So there's just a total lack of imagination amongst the entire foreign policy establishment about what's possible in international relations. And the only reason I think that I am qualified to say this is that I actually professionally studied the 40s and the 50s, when there were a bunch of thinkers like today really thinking about America's world role, and not everyone said that America should lead a liberal international order. There were ideas about more of a socialist international order, a less hierarchical international order, a more blatantly imperialist international order, and ideas about a liberal international order. But now there's only the liberal international order, right? And I think that's very problematic for envisioning what the United States can and should do in the world. And that's what the op-ed was really highlighting, is that if this guy could do what you want to do, what does that say about what you want to have done? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I guess what I would say is I only know foreign policy like a layperson, but I would think that material conditions more than ideology determine what is happening in the world. I don't know if that maybe that would term me a realist, but I don't think I know enough to get that label. But, America, despite...
Term you a Marxist.
Well, yeah, a vulgar Marxist.
Vulgar, yeah, orthodox.
America is still the dominant global economic and military power, so we're going to be in charge. Trump is doing things that could cause European countries to try to have a less deferential role on the world stage, but unless something materially changes in terms of the power relations, I don't think.
So I would say, I'm biased in this because I'm a historian of ideas, and though I'm sympathetic to economistic arguments, I do think that ideology really does, in the Gramscian sense, in the hegemonic sense, ideology really does inform what sorts of possible plans what sorts of possibilities are available to one. So just in what you just said, you said the United States is the X or Y most powerful, so it's destined to be in charge, or it's naturally in charge. And to some degree, that obviously material capability affects what one nation's able to do on the world stage. But I definitely think that at the very, very least, we could create a less hierarchical international system where the United States isn't taking as much advantage of as weak nations as it has been doing for the last 70 years. And I don't think that's necessarily utopian. I think it's utopian to think that the United States could just continue to govern, to continue to dominate all world regions for the rest of history. I think it would be in our own interest as a nation, if you want to take a nationalist tack, to actually work to create a less hierarchical international system, which is precisely what the liberal international order is not. It is precisely an order based on particular U.S. ideas and values which I actually think are to some degree great, at least in principle: democracy, human rights, et cetera, but they can't necessarily be exported in the way that the liberal international order assumes, and history has demonstrated time and time and time again.
Why don't we shift to a piece I mentioned earlier that I wrote and posted on Medium? We'll include a link to it. The Incredible Lightness of Donald, So I previewed this argument in a previous Blogging Heads with Robert Wright, but I encourage everyone to read it. It won't take you to Medium says it takes 3 minutes to read, but in brief, Trump is an absurd figure, but he is the president. And I managed to reach a kind of moment of psychological acceptance of this by just thinking like, okay, this is absurd, and it's kind of okay that it's absurd. And the sense that America is a special country, and we need to, and like I said, our sainted founding fathers gave us this sacred document, the Constitution. Well, the Constitution, unless something really crazy happened with those voting machines and the Russian hackers, everything worked the way it was supposed to, and yet Donald J. Trump, this deranged game show host, is our president. And I kind of am viewing things now through a lens of acceptance. Kind of, this crazy Scaramucci interview. It's like, okay, this is just kind of like another funny thing that's happening, and isn't it wacky that this guy is running around and talking about people sucking their own cocks, but he's in the White House. And, it's almost like a little bit like watching a reality TV show, since we have a reality TV star as our leader. What did you think of the piece?
Yeah, well, I also want to point out, I think you noted rightly in the piece that it's because you and I are both in privileged positions that we're not illegal. That's not the right word. Undocumented. Apologies. I was just reading some Fox News just to see what they were up to. But we're not undocumented, for example, and we don't have anything to really lose under Trump. So I think you're right to have highlighted in your piece that this is also even though there, as Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, I believe her name is, there are problems with privilege discourse. Yes, but we are both in positions of privilege. So just with that caveat, I think to some degree it's right, is that you just sort of have to accept it. And I actually wanted to ask you a question. So before Trump, would you say you were, quote unquote, a believer in American exceptionalism? And if so, what did that mean to you?
I believed in it in the sense that America was different because it was an immigrant society. It was a society based more around beliefs than blood and soil. But
compared to Germany.
Yeah, but the idea that America had some kind of American exceptionalism is used as the idea that the normal rules of history don't apply to the United States for some quasi-mystical reason. So I never bought into that. But or there's a unique mission for the United States is often how it's used. Yeah, I would have said before Trump's election that the U.S. is a special country and has been on net a good, a positive force in the world. Now I'm less sure about that, but yeah. So I guess there's something quasi-paradoxical in my argument about how I closed by talking about, we're normal now. We're not really special. Something bizarre has happened and it's made us less special. Maybe I never fully resolved that argument.
No, for sure. Well, I guess one of the first things you learn as a historian of foreign policy is that American exceptionalism is bullshit. So that's sort of like lesson number one, is that it's sort of a hot topic of debate in the 70s and the 80s in terms of professional historiography, and essentially was decided that no, America is not exceptional, and there's this new trend, sort of America is a nation among nations. It's unique, as every nation is unique, but it's also deeply and profoundly shaped by international processes, global processes, et cetera. So I think it's actually, if there was one salutary benefit that I would say could come from Trump's election, I think it was really expressed in your piece, is that it'll force people to confront sort of what this says about the American system, that this buffoon could be elected president in this way. And I think that, personally, more self-evaluation, soul-searching is only a good thing. So I think that's a really sort of positive thing to take from it, and that if this forces more people to confront the realities of recent American history and the realities of the American political system and the problems and prospects inherent in the system, and that it will be good. But personally, from a level, just to commiserate, I'm kind of like you. It's kind of like every day is this another crazy thing that's going to happen. And I'm not getting fatigued, and it's not even like a reality show. I'm actually finding myself tuning out a bit, and that kind of says something about the media ecosystem and raises more larger questions about technology and the role of the media and the role of Twitter and all of these sort of constantly updated beyond 24/7 news cycles. It's almost like the every 20-second news cycle. It's not 20. You have to think about it in sort of these short attention spans.
Yeah.
And what does this say, about this? Like we've all, at least people, you and I at least, have reached a sort of position of existential understanding where it's just like, it's really existentialist. It's like life has no meaning. Trump has no meaning. We're just sort of like unbearable. That's what Kundera was really saying.
Yeah.
And so the fact that we read it, I think, says something really interesting. And then it really comes to a question, because it's academics always critique, but what's the positive solution, right? Like, how do you make it so that these things have more of effect, or that they don't have, or that they're effective in the proper way? And that's really an interesting question, because we shouldn't necessarily reach a point of existential acceptance when someone's committing horrors.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is the Washington Post pop culture writer and former Blogging host Alyssa Rosenberg has started a regular column where she reviews the week in Trump as though it is like Big Brother, and it's a constantly rolling reality show. And she talks about the characters, and this seemed a little heavy-handed. This was unrealistic. But there was some good drama here. So I think that is a very astute way of looking at it. And it's postmodern in a sense that reality TV is super fake, and our president is a reality TV star, and he created his persona. He never. What I think one of the really smart things that has been written recently by Emily Nussbaum, where she went back and watched The Apprentice and The Celebrity Apprentice, and also some of Trump's appearances. Like, he used to appear on Letterman when Letterman was on NBC, and Trump created this image of himself as a successful businessman, even though he was largely a failure in business. But the fact that he pretended to be a successful businessman allowed him to become a successful businessman, and allowed him to become a successful candidate for the presidency. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. People always say Trump is a successful businessman. Maybe he was in terms of real estate, but he was quite an unsuccessful, if you know what I mean. But he was quite a successful businessman in terms of sort of postmodern branding. I mean, Trump was a brand 30 years before the Kardashians. So he clearly saw something in the culture and really saw a genius in that. I mean, I was watching. Someone posted on YouTube, 3.5 minutes of Trump's every cameo. And there's a very standard message in every time Trump appeared in like the OC or Home Alone. Not really in Home Alone 2. He's just there for a second, but in a bunch of the shows where he's essentially a smart businessman. People are coming to him for business advice, and that was his brand. And then he extended that in The Apprentice. So Trump, maybe he was a shitty real estate person, but real estate person, it's like the businessman does the business. Maybe he wasn't great at real estate, but he was certainly good at marketing himself in a very prescient way, decades before that became the standard. That people go on The Bachelor, they have 200,000 Instagram followers, and now they're making $100,000 a year. Yeah. So in that sense, he's a very, very actually ahead of his time.
No, I agree with that. I still think he is a stupid person, but he's certainly a canny con artist. And I got a little tripped up during the presidential campaign because I was operating under. I mean, so you grew up on Long Island. You must have been aware of who Trump was before The Apprentice.
Oh, most definitely.
So he was. I mean, he was just kind of a media figure. Like,
he was a Page Six guy.
Yeah, I knew who Ed Koch was, even though I didn't live in New York City. And I knew who Donald Trump was just because you would just hear things about him. And I remember my parents talking about him and his marriage.
Marla Maples.
Yeah, the Marla Maples thing. So people who grew up in the greater New York City area knew who Trump was and knew that he was essentially a talented con artist. So I convinced myself last year that he was just running, that it was the producers come to life and he was desperately trying to fail and would drop out at some point. I mean, when he was accusing Ted Cruz's father of killing JFK, and then he won the Indiana primary the next day.
Right.
It just seemed like he was desperately trying to fail, and yet it didn't. It kept on succeeding. Just like in the producers, the Springtime for Hitler is a massive success despite their best efforts. So I was wrong about that, but I still do think he is essentially a talented con artist, and he's
I think it's
one of the the greatest con in world history.
Well, I think it's important to recognize in the 80s and the 90s is that Trump, I think you're right, he was recognized as a con artist, but it was a lovable con artist. It was like almost one of our con artists. And there was a very sort of, I grew up actually, my family moved to Long Island when I was a teenager. I grew up in Rockaway, Queens. And, as outer-borough as one could possibly get, to some degree. And it was almost like he was one of ours. Like he was an outer borough guy. He was a Queens guy, but he had made good in Manhattan, to some degree. So there was definitely an element of Trump as lovable, and I think that's important not to underestimate. He wasn't considered like he was considered like a lovable cad, I guess, a lovable sort of cad.
What's
what's
he
Donald up to now?
Exactly. And there was did you read the piece that was in New York Magazine about the Morning Joe, Joe and Mika?
Yes.
So there was an interesting line in there where they were kind of palsy with Trump and had a falling out, obviously. But they said that there was a line where Trump would hand them a bottle of Trump branded water, but he would do it with a wink, where it was kind of like, I put my name on this tap water, but we all kind of know this is a joke.
Yeah, he's aware of his own vulgarity, right? And I think that element is now missing in President Trump, and I think that really has to do with cognitive impairment. I mean, I think we're going to look back on this and be like, oh, okay, the signs were clear. And I think it becomes clear when you compare him from the 80s until today. There's obviously been some sort of impairment going on. I'm not a doctor. This is just armchair sort of medicalizing, but it really seems to me as just an observer that something has change there, and maybe that sort of that postmodern element of breaking the fourth wall is no longer really there in Trump. I mean, Trump is really a postmodern figure in a real sense. I mean, New York in the 80s, it's Basquiat, Mapplethorpe, Trump. These are the three big figures, and it'd be interesting to sort of think of Trump in that light, coming out of this sort of 80s scene. Patrick Bateman, also the American Psycho, ultimate postmodern novel. And that was and Bateman was in love with Trump. I don't know if you read the novel.
I've never read it. That is interesting.
So there's this like 80s moment, that Trump is really connected to. And maybe the greatest crime the New York tabloids ever committed was getting, him really on the scene and using him to sell papers for 30 years, and this is sort of the upshot of that.
Yeah, and when the histories are written about how Trump rose to power, I mean, one of the chief villains will be Jeff Zucker, who was head of entertainment programming or something at NBC and helped develop The Apprentice, and then moved to CNN, and CNN would air Trump rallies straight through like every day, because it's great TV, you never know what's going to happen next. But this just gave him more and more oxygen, which he thrives on. But yeah, I definitely think that he is in the early stages of some kind of mental decline. Just the associative way he talks, he'll jump from one thing to the next. What do you think the 25th Amendment thing that Ross Douthat has written about?
Ross Douthat.
Do you think there's anything to that, or will that never happen?
No. Ross Douthat.
Wouldn't they rather
a constituency of one?
Wouldn't
it's truly a constituency of one.
Former blogging head Ross Douthat.
Oh yeah, you did it with Dan Savage. That was a good one.
I set that one up. That was one of my proudest accomplishmart when I was
That was a great one.
Working at Blogging Heads. No, but Ross catches a lot of shit, but I do think he's a smart guy.
He's a smart guy. He just represents literally no one but himself, which is the exact sort of person who shouldn't be on the New York Times opinion page.
Okay, fair enough.
But it's socialist.
The one thing I can't entirely figure out is why have more Republicans not turned on Trump and said, let's just make Pence, let's do it and make Pence president? Because Pence is a different kind of moron. He's not going to be causing, he's not going to be setting fires every day. He'll sign the bills that they send to him, and he'll appoint the judges that they want. Why do you think that hasn't happened yet, or do you think it's maybe going to happen?
It is hard to know what goes on behind the scenes, but it's also important not to overestimate the strategic genius of these people. As many people have said, I don't think they're thinking 2 steps ahead, let alone 6 steps ahead. I think there's a tendency to look on what's happening today and tomorrow, and not much further out than that. And I think you could see also, like, it'd be really interesting if someone were able to do a study on what types of people go to Congress, because you have or serve in government in the Republican Party nowadays, because you have absurd in the last 5 or 6 years, 2 absurd things have happened. One, Sarah Palin resigned her governorship of Alaska in order to try to become a reality T-star. And two, Jason Chaffetz.
Chaffetz, yeah.
Chaffetz, yeah, it's Chaffetz, but he pronounces it
right.
Chaffetz.
I only found that out recently, that he is a Jewish convert to Mormonism.
Yes, so Jason Chaffetz is I always pronounce it. Sorry, I always mispronounce it. Chaffetz in my mind. But he resigned because he wasn't going to be able to lead this campaign against Hillary. So this raises questions about who are the people who are actually becoming Congress people. You know, what does this say about them? And I think that's it. We assume this sort of public good or some sort of something. I don't think that's necessarily true. Yeah, I don't think it was ever true, and it's certainly not true now.
Yeah, I was tweeting just a day or so ago, like, why, the conventional understanding and political science understanding is like what these Congress people fear most is, getting voted out.
I don't think that's true.
Why do they want this shitty job to begin with? Like, they're traveling constantly. They can't see their families. They have to, like, pretend to be interested in what old people are saying. They have to shake all these people's hands and listen to them complain about their problems. That's not paid that much. I mean, there's the obvious possibility that they get a job as a lobbyist once they leave, but it just seems like a shitty job. And these people who, I mean, some of them are true believers and some of them are ideologues, but a lot of them are just mediocrities. Like, why do they want this crappy job?
I think that's true. I think a lot of them are mediocrities. And I think it'd be really, I mean, there's really interesting sociological work to be done. If it is done, I'm not aware of it, about who becomes a political consultant, who goes into Congress, what types of people do that, what are their motivations. I'd like to know more about that. And then I'd be able to give an answer that could really answer the question of why haven't they turned on Trump and just gone to Pence. And without that information, it's really difficult to know. But I'd love to know who these people actually are. I think that would be super interesting and super telling. What sort of class do they come from? What areas of the country do they come from? What's their education? What are their desires? What are their dreams, et cetera, et cetera? And I think then you'd be able to say something more likely. And sort of related to this, I've been wondering, like, when people get in power, why do they always toe the party line? It seems like if you wanted to be in power, you want to make a difference, and you get voted out. Who cares? You could go back to your law practice or do something else. It just seems so strange. And then this gets into the vagaries of a presidential system, which is different and probably not as effective in some ways as a parliamentary system. And it sort of forces people to toe the party line and leads to sort of ideological centrism as opposed to other things. But Aryeh, one thing I wanted to ask of you, based on your recent podcast where you self-described neoliberal AMA. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, so much of what I would say about the problems in our media class are specifically linked to sort of neoliberal capitalist incentives, to drive clicks, to make constant news changes, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you square that when it had this obviously deleterious effect on American politics with the commitment to neoliberal capitalism?
I guess I'd just say, what's the alternative?
The alternative is government funded. I mean, which has happened.
Oh well, the only radio I listen to is NPR. So right. I support both with the welfare state. And for people who missed the last episode, I was quoted in our article in Vice magazine. We're trying to figure out who actually identifies as a neoliberal, which is the term of abuse,
of derision.
Yeah, and the punching bag for people on both left and right. So yeah, it seems like capitalism is inevitable. Chasing.
Oh, well, I would disagree with that.
Well, maybe
that's a big claim.
Maybe that's a different episode.
Sure.
These just seem like material conditions, vulgar Marxism. You're always going to have garbage like this. You could have publicly funded broadcasts would be of a higher caliber, but unless you did something weird like requiring, broadcast licenses in order to have a website or something. Like, you're always going to have sort of populism embodied in chasing clicks and the kind of garbage that a lot of the media has currently.
And just to underline one thing is that this is not a problem of the last 10 years. This was a problem of a period I study, 1920s Weimar Germany, where people were worried about the cheap ability to sort of publish anything would also lead to the democratization of news. And that was for a long time. It's kind of fallen out of favor now, but for a long time, one of the major explanations for the rise of Nazism was sort of the massive amounts of print culture available to people. So this has been an issue that we've been confronting in communications and media for about 100 years. I was just curious. I don't think there's a good answer or an easy answer, but it seems like capitalism, or at least hyper capitalism like we have now, is a problem.
Yeah, and the currency. I mean, just look at how Twitter works. People just want the affirmation of a retweet and a like, even though I don't make any money off of Twitter. I doubt you do either. It's occasionally people can monetize it, but just
very rarely. Twitter is the strangest thing. There are people who are on there all the time, and it just seems like it's so interesting to me. It's such an interesting phenomenon. I mean, people are sharing the most intimate details of their lives with 100,000 strangers. And these are not. It's not like Chris Cillizza or someone who's famous, but like essentially random people. It's so interesting, and they have all these followers. I just don't understand. I mean, yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon.
And people do it because they want the social affirmation, and
but it's not real social affirmation. It's unless Twitter is a real public sphere. If Twitter is like a real public sphere, like the public sphere was in like the Agora or something along those lines.
It is in a weird way. What's interesting about Twitter is like everyone is equal in some way, because everyone is limited to 140 characters, and anyone can reply to anyone else. So the celebrities, the Kardashians have like 10 million followers, but if a famous person posts something and you have a funny reply, it can go viral in a way that like something on Facebook probably couldn't, or certainly
definitely not.
Certainly things never could in the pre-digital era.
But it goes viral, and then you get another 10,000 followers. But then you just have to keep on sort of producing content. It's like the ultimate capitalist treadmill. It's just like you're producing content and going nowhere. And it seems like I've only really been paying attention.
The only person benefiting is Twitter, and they're not even doing that good. It's crazy. It's a weird system that it doesn't seem like they've figured out how they can actually monetize what it is. It's almost, I've seen people kind of half jokingly say that it should be like
it should be a utility.
Yeah, it should. It's essentially like a public utility, and Trump, uses it that way. It is interesting to think what the people who created Twitter think about the fact that Trump, utilized it so powerfully during the campaign. I'm sure it's not what they.
And there's also just there's all this pathos. Like I've only been really paying attention for about 6 months since I finished my book, but it just seems like there's like a cycle of like Twitter breakdown. You leave, then you come back, you're contrite. There's all these really interesting. It's very fascinating.
It's psychodrama. Yeah,
it's very interesting.
Yeah, and I was joking on Twitter a couple days ago. Like, I don't think people who use Pinterest are constantly like, "Oh my God, Pinterest! I hate Pinterest so much." But I'm going to
post another 20,000 times.
Like, people on Twitter often call it this hell site. Like, I don't think people who use Spotify are calling it this hell site. It's tapped into something weird about human psychology that I don't think anyone has really elucidated yet.
But also the people who call it a hell site are the people who use it the most.
Yes,
I would never call Twitter a hell. I mean, like. It's very interesting. It's very, very, very fascinating.
Yeah,
it's just as an intellectual project.
The more followers you have, the more you get retweeted, and then the more kind of idiots see your posts and comment on it. So I've long thought that like anyone who has like a sizable Twitter following must get like just the worst of humanity like shouted at them constantly.
But I mean, I guess they do have a platform. I mean, I have like no followers, so I don't really know. But I guess if you have 20,000 people listening to you, theoretically, that's a real platform, and you could help organize and help spread your ideas in a really important way. So I guess it's good for that too.
Yeah, I mean, I have I'm like a D-list Twitter person, but I have around 1,000 followers, and if you follow the right people, it's a good way to get the latest news.
Yeah, I get a ton of my news from it.
There's a lot of really funny stuff on there, but
it's great.
It is ultimately a giant waste of time.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It seems I love Twitter and I get almost all of my news. Someone was just talking about it from them, but it seems like to wrap your own personal identity up in it is a very it's a gamble in like a real in like a real way. And I'd like someone to explore that more in like a sophisticated forum. It seems very I don't know. I've just been fascinated by it recently.
No one has written like the great Twitter like sociological analysis as far as I know. Probably because they're spending too much time on Twitter and are thinking of 140 character jokes to make and don't have nothing. You can't accomplish anything.
Everybody's a comedian on Twitter. Also, it's really funny. Everyone's a comedian.
Yeah, and that's one of the weird things. I think I first realized this during the 2012 presidential debates between Romney and Obama. Was like every political journalist secretly wishes that they were a Daily Show correspondent.
Right.
And they want to because people were just cracking jokes nonstop. And it's kind of like, well, this is not what I want from you, but it seems to be what their kind of like inner expression wants to be.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. Sorry to get off on that tangent.
No, I think it is. It consumes a lot of my time.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at it all the time. I'm also afraid, like it's also interesting to me, it's sort of the self-censorship that goes out on Twitter. Like I don't want to post anything just in case I say the wrong thing by mistake, which could be,
and you could ruin, I don't know whether you have tenure or not, but I'm sure you could write something on Twitter that would negatively affect your career.
Which has happened to a lot of people. It seems like you could only negatively affect your career, especially in certain media spheres and academic spheres. It doesn't seem like it would be ever much of a help.
Yeah, for normal people, you could maybe get on the Ellen DeGeneres show or something. If you have a particularly successful tweet, you get a lot of attention. Maybe you could sell T-shirts, but it seems like you could harm your life a lot more than you could help your life if you screw up somehow. So
I'm always approaching it with kid gloves. But yeah, thanks for sort of talking that out with me a little bit.
And for people who haven't read it, there's a really interesting book by John Ronson called "So You've Been Publicly Shamed."
Exactly.
That's about this phenomenon. I mean, that's maybe one of the few in-depth considerations of social media that's come out so far. And he profiles people who have become normal people have become at the center of these social media storms and talks about what happens to them. Is there anything else you want to hit before we close out?
No, that's it. Thanks so much for taking the time.
So thanks for coming on. So if people do want to follow you on Twitter, the link to your Twitter account will be below the video. For our viewers and listeners, if you like Culturally Determined, you can rate it on iTunes, and that helps new people find Culturally Determined. So do that if you want, or just comment below and let us know what you thought of the episode. So Daniel, thanks for coming on, and talk to you later.
Thanks so much, Aryeh.